All right, guys. So another big aspect of the 14th century upheavals that usher in the beginning of the modern era, there's going to be a lot of upheavals in the church, and this is really important to learn about now, because then we're going to kind of recap this when we get to during the time of the Renaissance, when we move towards the period we know as the Protestant Reformation, when the Catholic Church is going to fracture. It's important to know that kind of the seeds that are planted that lead to that Reformation are actually starting more in the High Middle Ages than actually during the time period of Martin Luther. It's a long time period of upheaval and corruption in the church that leads to eventually the fracture that we're going to learn about in the Reformation that we're going to get to in the next chapter. Um, we're going to have a lot of spiritual issues going on in the church, a lot of scandal, a lot of division taking place, mostly beginning as we learned about in section one, where Philip the Fourth of France literally hijacks the papacy and brings it to Avignon. We know when Philip the Fourth has poor Pope Boniface the Eighth kind of attacked. Poor Boniface dies, and then Philip kind of controls the next election of a French pope, convinces that French pope to move to Avignon, and we enter what's known as the Babylonian captivity of the church, where for the next 70 some odd years, the church is going to be in Avignon and not in Rome, and so in France and not in Italy. Uh, it's kind of ironic, being that the Pope was the Bishop of Rome. So, as we said, in 1305, Pope Clement V, a Frenchman, moves the papal court to Avignon, France, and he'll be there from 1309 to 1378. Not him, subsequent popes afterwards as well. And what's going to happen with that is then the people of Rome are going to elect their own pope, and then some other people are going to elect their own pope. So by 1378, we are going to get three popes at once, all claiming that the other two popes are the anti-pope, and it's going to cause a lot of confusion, a lot of fracturing of the Catholic identity in Europe, and we're going to call this the Western Schism of the Church, because you're going to get people who support the Pope in Rome, support the Pope in Avignon, support the other Pope in Italy. That's going to be pretty crazy. Um, Eventually, though, under the leadership of people like Catherine of Siena, we're going to see that we will have a church council, and this council will bring in the formation of the modern papacy, which will have far less political power than the age of papal supremacy, but much more trying to bring back some spiritual power. In the end, that won't even work, though, because the popes after that are going to be Renaissance popes, like partying all the time, which we'll learn about in the next chapter, leading us into the rise of the Protestant Reformation. But in 1417, we're going to have what's called the Council of Constance, and the Council of Constance is going to bring one official pope back to Rome, and it's going to lead us into the Renaissance papacy, which in some regards is good because it's only one pope. In other regards, you have some really, really bad popes, like Popes Gone Wild, that we'll learn about in the next chapter. We're also going to get a time period where individual preachers are going to push back against the church teachings that they don't agree with, and also kind of the corruption and almost like the fact that the church is dominated by nobility. By the time we get 200 years after the Cluniac reforms, the church is back to its ways, where you get the selling of church offices, you got popes having secret lady friends and all that, and defying the vows of celibacy, bishops living like lords, and so you're going to have some pushback. One of the early pushbacks is going to come from a British theologian who's going to be named John Wycliffe. And John Wycliffe is a professor at Oxford University. Again, when you talk about Mr. Winter's flip on all the stuff going on at this point culturally, it's the age of universities. And who runs universities? The church. Okay. And this Oxford professor is going to say that the Bible, not the church, not the teachings of popes, not the infallibility of the pope, not church councils, is going to be the source of our faith. So scripture alone is the source of our faith, not things like good works or things like what people in the clergy out of church councils say is dogma. Um, Eventually, though, the Pope's basically going to say, shut up, or we're going to charge you with heresy. You're going to be burned at the stake. John Wycliffe's going to kind of step back, but his ideas and his writings are going to influence a whole generation in the Renaissance of thinkers who are going to move away from the dogma of the idea of papal infallibility and whatnot. A more radical reformer at this time is going to come out of the East, mostly we would say in the modern day Czech Republic area of Europe, and his name is Jan Hus. He's at the time period we call the area comes from an eastern part of the Czech Republic we call Bohemia. He's a preacher, and he tries to reform the church in the east, trying to get away from the fact that like bishops are selling land, they don't care about money, they only care about what's coming in from the church and the tithe. Um, and he's going to really get a big movement in Eastern Europe to the point where he's literally going to scare the papacy. Um, he is going to be branded a heretic, but the Pope's going to trick him. He's going to be really supported by the nobles in the East, in the area we call the Czech Republic today, or at this time we call it Bohemia. And the Pope's going to trick him by inviting him to Rome to debate over the issues he thought were important. And when he gets to Rome, they arrest him and they burn him at the stake. But he kind of becomes a martyr, especially in the East, and his ideas will certainly take root, and we'll see them rear their head in the 16th century in the form of Martin Luther and other people who are going to literally break from the Catholic Church. So we like to say, like, Wycliffe and Huss, they kind of like they lay the egg that Luther later hatches. Okay, they kind of plant the seeds of discontent and kind of give the message that it should be about the scripture, it should be about the religion, not about the money, not about the worldly power, not about the corruption. So just keep those guys in mind when we talk about the upheavals in the church. And then here is Wycliffe, here's Huss, and here's Jan Hus being burned at the stake. His hair's on fire. Kind of weird picture, but interesting enough. All right, another big idea we're going to have going on here is a huge military fight that's going to take place over about 116 years, and not all at once, kind of like in different stages, between England and France, the two major superpowers that have grown into nation states, as we remember from section 1 of this chapter. So England and France are going to fight a series of wars between 1337 and 1453 in Europe. Not all at once. Okay, it's all multi-generational at different times. There's times of peace, in particular during the Black Death, they kind of calm down and don't fight each other. But it's going to be a pretty long battle between the two. The war begins when Edward III of England claims the French crown. The French king had died. He had a son, but Edward thought he had a better claim to the throne. His mother, Edward III's mother, was a French princess. From the beginning, you think of like William the Conqueror coming from France and all that stuff. So Edward III is going to claim the French crown. This is the same Edward who is going to, from section 1, be the guy who forms parliament. Remember, he says what affects all should be approved by all. What he's talking about is launching a war into France. So Parliament, the development of such, is going to take place due to this 100 Years' War. But really, overall, too, there's a lot of trade rivalries where these English kings had a lot of land holdings in France. John I had lost a bunch of those during the time period of the Magna Carta, but they still wanted to control a lot of that, especially, to the south of Europe and to the east, into Constantinople. So a lot of trade rivalries will play into this fight as well. And at first, the English are going to be really successful in winning a bunch of battles under, not only Edward III, but his son Henry V, etc. They're going to win the Battle of Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, and Agincourt in 1415. They're going to do this with a secret weapon called the longbow. It's a giant bow and arrow that took years to learn how to shoot. But a good English bowman can launch like 3 arrows in like a minute. And the arrow was so powerful, launch of this giant bow that it could pierce armor. So the longbow is going to allow the English as a secret weapon to defeat the French in all these battles. But eventually the French are going to catch up. So it looks pretty bad for the French, and the English are going to conquer most of France. That is until 1429. This is when a most unexpected figure is going to show up in this story. It's a little French peasant girl who allegedly was told by God that she should lead the armies of France. She's going to travel to the south of France, where she's going to meet the Dauphin. That's the uncrowned French king, or the prince, who thinks he should also lead France, not the English. And she's going to convince the Dauphin that she should be allowed to lead armies. And for some reason, he agrees. He says, okay, French peasant girl, you take some armies. And miraculously, she's literally going to win a bunch of battles, leading armies in battle. she is going to take back the French city of Orleans, and after that, the French army is going to get all jabbed up again to fight back against the British. It looked like all hope was lost. Unfortunately, she is captured by the British, and they charge her with witchcraft because she said she could hear voices and talk to God, but they just kind of want to get rid of her, and they burn her at the stake. But really, Joan of Arc inspires the French, and over the next subsequent years, they're going to push back against the British and push the British almost totally out of any territories they had once owned in France. By 1453, the English literally own a little area called Calais and a little tip of a place called Brittany in France, and that's about it. They've lost all their ancestral holdings going back to William the Conqueror. It's over. We can thank Joan of Arc, which is pretty crazy story. If you get a chance to read more into that, it's pretty unbelievable. But anyhow, overall, what happens is by 1453, we've kind of established then by that point all English noble holdings in France that had gone back to William the Conqueror are gone. You have two separate nation states, which is really big. And again, here you get an idea with this map how far the English had moved down. Here's Poitiers, etc. You can see by the end, this area in Crécy and Calais, it's about it for what the English have. Maybe a little part of Brittany here. Here's Edward III. Here's Joan of Arc. Here you can see the big idea is going to happen in the Hundred Years' War. The trade routes are going to bring us gunpowder from China, so you're going to get cannons, which is going to have a lot of things there, and the longbow used by the British. And also, when they would capture British troops, they would cut off their middle fingers because that was what they used to fire the longbow. And it's one of the reasons why holding up a middle finger to somebody means a really bad word nowadays, because the British soldiers would show that to the French and say, I still have my middle finger and I can still kill you with my longbow. But that's another story for another day. What are the impacts of the Hundred Years' War? Why is this an important part of that 14th century of upheaval? Number one, you get a growing sense of nationalism. You're going to have this idea that now you have like a modern people who are like, I'm French. It's not that I belong to some noble who is also an English noble who owns my land. It's like, I'm French, I speak French, or I'm English, I speak English, and I love England. So for the first time, we're going to break down feudalism. We're going to have nationalism under king, country, all those ideas. Also, too, you're going to get the idea that starting with Edward III, Parliament is going to be consulted on using, the idea of the House of Commons having a vote on if they're going to release money to the king to fight a war. So Parliament's going to get the part of the purse, which will become much more important as we get into the age of absolutism that we'll talk about. I think most important, though, you're going to have huge new technologies that are going to really stop the Middle Ages. Cannons are going to make castles obsolete. Longbows are going to make armor obsolete. Eventually, the crossbow is going to make it so that you really don't have knights anymore on horseback. It's going to bring an end to all this stuff we think about with the Middle Ages. Start to bring in the idea of also like big armies with guns. Eventually, gunpowder is going to lead to muskets and guns and all the things we're going to think about with later armies. So it really brings about an end to the Middle Ages, and also to bigger armies. Kings need large armies. They pay themselves. You don't need feudalism anymore. You don't need nobles. You don't need any of that. So that's all going to end. And really sets the stage for the Renaissance and the Reformation and eventually the Age of Exploration. So the chapters we're going to do up until the end of the year, their beginnings, kind of the Hundred Years' War, the Black Death, the changes in the church are all going to bring about kind of all the things we're going to talk about towards the end of the year. So that's basically it. And we will move into the Renaissance.